For 20 years, Boggs worked alongside James, who was a Trinidadian historian, and together they collaborated on works mostly for the workers' rights of people across the world. But eventually James and Lee split ways, largely because Grace Lee Boggs gained a new partner in life that radically reshaped her understanding of social justice and radical activism, her life partner, Jimmy Boggs. Grace Lee Boggs with Jimmy, whose given name was James but always went by Jimmy, and if you talk to anyone about Jimmy, you'll say he did not like the name James. They were often understood as a marriage of two radical activists rooted in mutual respect and equality, but explosive disagreements. So if you ever went to dinner at the Boggs house, you were going to hear a fight because they were going to argue about everything around the world. They were both intellectuals and activists. They came from very different walks of life, however. Grace grew up in New York City and received an Ivy League education. Jimmy grew up in the rural South, gaining his revolutionary education on the front lines of factory work. They made an unlikely pair, but their partnership helped them both grow, even through their struggle. Jimmy worked with his community, particularly the young and the elderly. As Grace noted, Jimmy believed that revolutions should be made for love of people and place, not because of hate. Grace and Jimmy met after Grace relocated to Detroit, Michigan to edit the radical newsletter Correspondence. The couple would become the city's probably most famous activist and would later co-author a book called Revolution and Evolution in the 20th Century. They were heavily involved in organizing on behalf of the racial justice as early members of Detroit's Black Power movement, as well as pushing for radical transformation of America's economic systems. There's some irony, however, because they were working during the McCarthy era. And as you might note, anybody who was viewed as anti-capitalist during the McCarthy era was blacklisted and usually put on some sort of list someplace. But Grace Lee really confused the FBI because they did not understand how in the world a Chinese American woman was working on behalf of Black Power. So much so that in their writings about her, so you can go and look at their documents about her, they labeled her as having to be both African and Asian because there's no way she would do this work otherwise. That's obviously not true, but that's what they thought, right? So what did their work actually look like? We're quite lucky because Grace and Jimmy not only worked in their communities to effect change, but they often wrote about it, reflecting on their approach to social justice. In this way, Grace Lee Boggs' foundation as an academic philosopher, it never left her. Make sure I can go. There we go. Yeah. She continued to kind of do that hands-on work that she wanted to, but she always wrote about it. And left a plethora of ideas for us, current academics and social justice activists, to learn from. First, Grace Lee Boggs notes in her autobiography that when she went to Detroit, her primary aim was to, quote, return to the concrete. By this, Grace meant that she did not want to experience the movement secondhand, but to be at the forefront of the movement within her beloved new community of Detroit. And as many activists reflect on Grace Lee and Jimmy Boggs' work, they often note how this work occurred in their living room. Their home, a rental that they cared for as if they owned it, became the hub of the movement, with famous activists sleeping on their couches and theorizing at their kitchen table. One of the key places that Grace and Jimmy worked was in the Black Power movement. They even had Malcolm X sleeping on their couch for several days when he visited Detroit. In her autobiography, she shares what her experiences was like with the Black Power movement. In 1961, however, no one was talking about Black Power. It would take a decade of practical and theoretical struggle, culminating in the 1967 rebellion, to establish the idea. To build the Black Power movement, people coming from different backgrounds and with differing points of voice had to work together. For the most part, ignoring or smoothing over our differences because of our sense of urgency, and also because we could feel our humanity stretching as we organized for a common cause. Arguably, Grace Lee Boggs is one of the most unusual and unknown figures of the Black Power movement. As a Chinese American, she relied heavily on cross-racial solidarity, challenging the use of identity politics to form a movement and seeking out liberation for her shared community. As I noted, when pursuing her PhD, Boggs became interested in the work of many different activists and scholars like George Wilhelm, Friedrich Hegel, Immanuel Kant, and Karl Marx. Their theories of social change inspired her approach to rooting out societal inequality. But she did not just listen to them, she wanted to apply them and change their work. When Grace Lee initially worked in the movement, she sought revolution. But as she aged and continued in the struggle, she began theorizing about how revolution might best be achieved. As scholars and activists, her reflective writing on these ideas are invaluable. She and Jimmy sought to work on supporting the movement through recognizing that rebellion required revolutionary leadership. One without the other would result in harm, destruction of marginalized communities, and demoralization of radical politics. In her autobiography, she talks about the rise in young people joining the Black Power movement, but also her concerns about how the rebellion would turn into a sustained revolution. She notes that she, Jimmy, and other activists would often have long conversations about best practices. As we talked into the night, especially between 1968 and 1974, I felt a liberation comparable to that which I had first experienced back at Bryn Mawr, when the study of Hegel had helped me to see my own struggle as an integral part of the evolution of the human race. Inside my mind and heart, the materialist concept of revolution, as chiefly a redistribution of goods, property, and power, was being enriched by a moral and spiritual dimension. But to achieve this type of liberation, she notes that feminism greatly shaped her ideas. Specifically, by the late 1960s, a feminist movement was taking shape that began theorizing about politics differently. A key phrase emerged from this movement: the personal is political. I can tell you it's a phrase we still use today in our women's and gender studies classrooms. Although the origin of the phrase the personal is political is unknown, it became popular following the publication of an essay by Carol Hanisch in 1970, who argued that many personal experiences, particularly from women, can be traced to one's location within a system of power and relationships. Grace Lee Boggs agreed, and particularly noted that revolutionary activists not only needed to transform their personal lives to engage in this work, but also strongly believed in the need of consciousness raising and self-reflective work of activism to recognize one's relationship to power. In her autobiography, she notes, "The oppressed internalize the values of the oppressor. Therefore, any group that achieves power, no matter how oppressed, is not going to act differently from their oppressors as long as they have not confronted the values that they have internalized and consciously adopted different values." In her last book, The Next Revolution, she stressed, it is, quote, "a time of deep change, not just of social structure and economy, but also of ourselves. If we want to see change in our lives, we have to change things in ourselves." Ultimately, Grace Lee and Jimmy Boggs sought to sustain a community-based revolution in Detroit. When asked what they meant by this, Grace notes, "This is the key to the distinction between rebellion and revolution. Rebellion is a stage in the development of revolution, but it is not revolution in itself. It's an important stage because it represents the standing of the oppressed. Rebellions break the threads that have been holding the system together and throw into question its legitimacy and the supposed permanence of existing institutions. A rebellion disrupts the society, but it does not provide what is necessary to make a revolution and establish a new social order. To make a revolution, people must not only struggle against existing institutions, they must make philosophical and spiritual leaps and become more human beings. In order to change and transform the world, they must change and transform themselves." And the only way to become a more human, according to Grace Lee, was to raise one's consciousness, reflect on one's social location, and to work on the ground with oppressed communities. And that is what Grace Lee Boggs did throughout her life, reimagining what revolution would look like. Eventually, however, she found that revolution did not seem sustainable. This is one of my favorite quotes from her. She noted in particular that revolution didn't often result in concrete solutions, and she wanted to go from revolution to solutionaries. That's her phrase. 2 years before her death, she gave an interview where she talked about this particular idea, particularly as it relates to feminism. Here's a quote from that interview. 70 years ago, when I joined the radical movement, the paradigm or generally accepted concept of revolution came from the 1917 revolution in Russia. Being a revolutionary meant preparing yourself and your organization to seize state power. During the 20th century, the very idea of becoming a revolutionary lost its appeal because that paradigm of revolution had been discredited by the increasing bureaucratization of the Soviet state, and no one had reimagined what it means to be a revolutionary. The first time I even heard the word solutionary was a few years ago on a ride from Detroit to Chicago. Barbara and her friend Myrtle were driving, and they were carrying on a lively conversation about the way women, and especially mothers, multitask, solving one problem after one every minute of every day. I was in the passenger seat listening when I heard one of them say, "Women are solutionaries." And suddenly I recognized that everything that Detroiters were doing to survive in our devastated and deindustrialized city was not only making the next American Revolution, but changing the paradigm of revolution. In this 2013 reflection on her life's work, Grace Lee Boggs indicates that many different social movement influences on her life and activist philosophies. Her grassroots approach to solutions for change was inspired by civil rights work, Black Power work, and feminism. She shows us the importance of not limiting oneself based on identity, and instead seeking complex solutions to change the world for the better. One example of her solutionary approach was the creation of Detroit Summer, an organization that actually still exists to this day. Boggs was a strong believer in the power of young people to transform their environments, as well as the importance of rising to support them in that process. In 1992, Grace and Jimmy established Detroit Summer. The organization was inspired by Fannie Lou Hamer's Freedom Summer, with an emphasis on rebuilding the city of Detroit by young people. Today, it's a multiracial, intergenerational collective. Its members say that they are working to transform themselves and their communities by confronting the problems they face with creativity and critical thinking. To help you learn a little bit more about this, I wanted to share actually a video from them where the current young people who are involved in this organization actually are sharing their experiences. So let me pull this up in one moment. Sorry, I'm waiting for the, there it goes. Here's the video. Okay.
Stand up if you know somebody who has dropped out of high school.
Detroit Summer has been around since 1992 as a way for youth in Detroit to take leadership in changing the city for the better through creative and sustainable solutions. The way that we approach making change is through hip hop, through arts, and through media, as well as through taking action.
We painted a house for an elderly woman in the neighborhood. We would hear stuff like, "Oh, we used to be afraid of kids," you know. It was like such a boost for me who so craves being seen as somebody who was ready to make a difference. I think what I got from Detroit Summer is I was allowed to figure out who I needed to be.
Time stands still for nobody. You gotta keep it moving every second of the clock if you wanna make it in this world, but you gotta be patient. After high school, before I went to college, because again, I felt like I still didn't gain a sense of what I wanted to do and what I wanted to go to school for, or if I even should go back to school, you know. So through like community organizing, working with Detroit Summer, I realized that like I was that navigator to be like, okay, this is how I want to learn, this is what I want to learn, and this is what I can contribute.
Martin Luther King had said that in our dying cities, what our young people need are projects that transform themselves and their environment at the same time. And that Detroit Summer was along the lines of what Martin Luther King had projected.
When I read the call for Detroit Summer, Jimmy and Grace had come to my school. The call that they put out talked all about how young people had always made the difference in movements. Detroit was struggling, but that it would take young people again to really help rebuild it and redefine it and respirit it. There was also a way that I could make a difference in the city, that it just wasn't going to be like this bad place, and I was helpless to do anything about it. But I knew I wanted to be a teacher through Detroit Summer because what I liked about my job and what I thought I was good at in my job was talking to young people.
When I graduate, like next year in 2011, I can just go out there and make a change and do something right for me.
I know that I'm successful because of the people who loved me when I was 16 and who love my kids now, and that's what families do, right? They watch you grow and guide you and serve as models, and that's precisely what the adults of Detroit Summer did for me and so many other people.
So that's just a quick window into what Detroit Summer actually looks like. It's an incredible organization that still exists now, unfortunately, in the memory of Grace and Jemmy Lee Boggs. I'll note that Jemmy Boggs died in 1992. And as Grace Lee notes in her autobiography, she never imagined a life without Jemmy, having lived and worked beside him for more than 30 years. But eventually she found her way, and she wanted to uphold his legacy and cement her own. She didn't want to just be known as his wife, but as her own activist. After his death, she continued her activism until she was 98 years old. She actually wrote a weekly column for the Michigan Citizen and promoted civic reforms. And then in 2013, 2 years before her death, she was 98, she established the James and Grace Lee Boggs School, a community-based charter school with a curriculum focused on Detroit. In fact, I had the incredible honor of visiting this school when I was there in November. The students who go to the school, it's K through 8th grade, gave us a tour of the school itself. I actually got a tour from a young 8-year-old who showed me every single classroom and talked to me about her curriculum and demonstrated such incredible self-understanding, maturity, and growth. It was incredible to see what an education like the Grace Lee Boggs and Jemmy Lee Boggs School can do, because it focuses on self-empowerment, particularly for students who come from very diverse backgrounds, and it was really cool to see that. You can see here on the right-hand side, I took a picture of the mural inside this school, and the mural kind of is a way for us to see about how we can change the world and create the world that we want to see in particular. In this way, Grace Lee Boggs continues to transform lives, even after her death, which occurred months after her 100th birthday in 2015. So as I mentioned, I had the honor of viewing Grace and Lee and Jemmy Boggs' home this past fall, and I'm actually going to share with you a series of pictures of the home itself, so you can kind of see their life. It's quite humble. You know, they're living in a working class neighborhood in Detroit. The house was not one they ever owned. It was purchased by the Grace Lee and Jemmy Boggs Foundation after their death, so they own it now, but they didn't actually ever own it in life. And I'm going to go through and kind of explain some different pieces for you. It's exciting to see this because it's before it's become a museum, so we get to kind of see the early stuff, right? So this is the home itself. You can kind of see the outside. It's just it's relatively small. They lived mostly on the first floor, which had 3 bedrooms and 1 bathroom, a living room and a kitchen. This is the Boggs living room. This is where much of the organizing happened. And we often talk about the famous yellow couch. Malcolm X slept here. This was kind of the couch that all of the activists who needed a place to stay in Detroit would come stay. So we all took pictures on it and we're excited to be around it. The home is filled to the brim with books. As you can tell from Grace Lee's life and Jemmy Boggs, they were intellectuals, right? And so they were activists, but they also read constantly. And as someone who also loves to read and loves to know about this stuff, it was cool to see what are the ideas that shaped my hero's brain, right? And you can see here different pictures of their libraries. They have one room totally dedicated to books, and that's where that kind of map is, so it shows you the different things that they had. But then literally every place you turn, there's just books stacked on each other everywhere you go. This is her office. You can see some of the art on the front door. It's left intentionally messy, right? Those are her notes just sitting there on the desk that no one's touched since 2015, which I think is a pretty incredible concept. I also love the wallpaper, so I was like, let's try to find this for myself. Throughout the house, just humbly laying around are various awards that she received, not in glass cases or anything special, but kind of showing her incredible life. For example, the Dr. King Medal of Service that she received. They're just kind of laying around throughout the house, which I always found interesting. I wanted to close today's conversation not with my words, but with Grace Lee's, because her words are the ones that matter. So here is just some closing thoughts from her, and then we can have a conversation.
The tendency is to look to existing structures for leadership. And it's only when existing structures don't resolve the questions that need to be resolved that we begin to create new concepts of leadership. And we're in the stage of creating new concepts of leadership now. We've watched a lot of changes take place in the concept of leadership over the last period. I had no idea how important Martin Luther King was when I was in the 60s. And it's only as violence in our neighborhoods began to increase that I began to listen differently to King. And I read his speeches and I thought about how he said that what our young people need are opportunities to transform themselves and transform their communities at the same time. And I saw that he had a concept of two-sided transformation that we hadn't had in society up to then. Up to then, we had thought it was only those on the other side who needed to be overthrown. And we didn't realize that when we split the atom and we dropped the bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, that we'd become the enemy, that we also needed transformation. And that's a huge leap forward. Our understanding tends to create boxes, and those boxes tend to trap us, whereas reason is able to see the positive in the negative. How we think, our philosophies matter a lot.
So, to close, Grace Lee Boggs leaves us with a legacy of how to affect change, how to fight for equity for more people. She notes the importance of listening to the elderly, empowering young people, engaging in intersectional activism, and challenging identity politics. And in that way, I think she's someone in this moment and many others that we should turn to as we try to make the world a better place for all in this space and in others. So thanks so much for having me today.